Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name's Naomi and I'm a Methodist minister in North Kent. And today's guest is Anthony Lees-Smith. Welcome, Anthony.
Morning. I hope they're hearing.
Morning. It's great to have you here. Canon Dr Anthony Lees-Smith is Canon Missioner at Chester Cathedral, where he oversees the education programme, arts and exhibitions, and community engagement. A former primary school teacher, Anthony has spent most of the past 25 years living and working in religiously diverse communities, an experience which became the focus of his doctoral research. So it's great to have you with us today, Anthony. And we're also joined from JPIT today by Adam Orcock, JPIT's Advocacy Coordinator. Welcome, Adam.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Good.
Good. Excellent. Well, great to have you both here. Anthony, we're going to start with the question that we ask most of our guests. We'd love to know your thoughts on, does politics belong in the pulpit?
A short answer, yes. I think for me, faith is all about it. Faith has to be lived, and I think I think that's something that Jesus makes really clear in terms of it being not something that the word doesn't have to be just heard; it needs to be acted upon. And so I think if we're gonna live out our faith in relation to the world and to others, then that automatically then impacts our thoughts on how we live together as a society, how we interact with the world around us, how we vote, and how we encourage, or where we might encourage, or where we might challenge as well in our society. So absolutely, I think it speaks into politics. I used to tell my congregation, I won't tell you what to vote, but I will encourage you to open your Bibles, to pray, and to engage your faith when you are voting.
Mm, mm, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you. So to set the context, we're recording this on the 22nd of June. So the big headline this morning is that Keir Starmer has announced his resignation as Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party. There's also a 4-day extreme heat warning that's been issued across the UK. The right-wing millionaire De La Espriella has won Colombia's presidential election, and the US-Iran war peace talks are continuing in Switzerland despite tensions. We're going to be looking today at the lectionary readings for Sunday, the 5th of July. So we've got Genesis chapter 24, verses 34 to 38, 42 to 49, and 58 to 67. We've got Psalm 45, verses 10 to 17, or you could also have a look at Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 8 to 13. We've got Romans chapter 7, verses 15 to 25a, and Matthew 11, verses 16 to 19, 25 to 30. There are some alternative readings as well from Zechariah and the Psalms that you might want to have a look at. In terms of awareness days, there's Plastic Free July, and on the 5th of July, we're also marking NHS Day. So, with all of that in mind, let's dig into the texts. So, Anthony, was there a particular passage that grabbed you that you'd like to start with?
Yeah, well, I think the gospel for me, I partly because I've been feeling very, very tired recently. So naturally drawn to that, that wonderful verse, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens." But I think actually, in light of what we've just been hearing about Keir Starmer's resignation, I think there's something as well in that passage about leadership and about how difficult that is. So I think there's a lot in that, which I think would probably be where I'd want to start.
Mm. Yes, I was really struck by that rereading this passage this morning, that it feels so relevant for those
Mm.
conversations about leadership and how difficult it is to lead in the public eye. That John the Baptist was doing one thing and they condemned him for it. Jesus did something very different and they condemned him for that as well. It does raise the question of whether it's possible to be a successful prime minister here at the moment, whether that's even possible. So, what were your thoughts about the passage, Anthony?
So I think I mean, it's interesting that this bit, particularly the "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens," that this comes after Jesus has been saying some pretty challenging stuff. Actually, sending out the disciples, telling them that they're going to face persecution. He talks about bringing peace, not peace, but a sword. There's some really challenging stuff, and so to get this at the end, I think is a really helpful thing to kind of land on after um, we know that our calling, particularly if we're going to engage in activism and engage politically as Christians in the world, that it will be challenging. There will be difficulties. We will get pushback. And so to know that actually there is a place where we can be refreshed and find strength and solidarity in Christ, I think is really important.
Mm. Yes, I think that's so true. I remember being really struck the first time someone said to me that sermons should comfort the challenged and challenge the comfortable. And that
Yeah.
sense that we need both because the gospel offers us both. It offers us a real challenge and some really difficult tasks, but also, as you say, that place where we can come, particularly those in our churches who are going through a really tough time and need to hear
Mm.
that invitation to come to somewhere where they can rest and be held and refreshed. Adam, what did you think of the Matthew passage?
I'm going to hold my hands up and admit that I read the wrong passage in preparation for this, but I have just I've looked through it now, and I think it does tie into well, what I thought about some of the other passages and what I think might be a nice kind of overarching message to tie some of the passages together about that being faithful and being kind of trusting and that kind of deliverance of God. It talks about the yoke and the burden and things. And yeah, I found that through the some of the other passages as well. There's a request to do something difficult or do something kind of take a leap of faith. And yeah, I thought that was something that I would pull into this passage as well.
Mm, mm,
I was just going to say, I think also the one of the things that really struck me was this idea of Sabbath rest, and I was very fortunate a few years ago to have a sabbatical and reflect a bit on the idea of Sabbath rest, and Walter Brueggemann's work on rest and Sabbath as a form of resistance was a really powerful read to me, and through that I came across the work of Tricia Hersey, something called the Nap Ministry. She's known as the Nap Bishop, and it's this idea of rest as a form of resistance against that a kind of hyper efficiency, that drive towards productivity, consumerism that we see so much in society. And I think that call to rest is really important. So Tricia Hersey's work is built very much on a kind of womanist theology, and we see so much exhaustion, particularly among those who are on the sharp end of receiving discrimination, prejudice in our world. That that it's really important to hear the message that actually they're not alone. That there are people who will stand and carry that burden when you are too exhausted to do that. I've worked with people who after 40 years being involved in racial justice work, particularly, and seeing so little change, understandably have become jaded and cynical, and it was only kind of when I came across some of this work that I really began to get that and understand that. And so I think, um, that, and interestingly, Jesus goes on immediately after this passage to challenge the whole idea of the Sabbath and what the purpose is of the Sabbath. So I think that idea of Sabbath rest as a form of resistance, is something that I want to kind of bring out as well with this passage.
mm. Yes, I don't want to rub it in, but I'm on sabbatical at the moment. So I've been thinking a lot about
Lovely.
that myself. And I think, as you say, that's such an important challenge to a worldview that says you're only worth as much as your work. You're only worth as much as how productive you are. And there was an episode of this podcast a few weeks ago where we were thinking about that in relation to benefits and sanctions and the idea that people are only worth as much as they can produce, they're only worth as much as their work, but something that says, no, your worth is so much greater than that. You are worthy because you were created by God, you're made in the image of God, and you are loved by God. So even when you stop, you are still worthy and valued. And as well as people who've been working really hard for 40 years or really having to push when it comes to campaigning and advocacy and finding that really difficult, I find that an important message for people I serve in my churches who are older, less able to do the things that they used to really enjoy doing and got a real sense of meaning and purpose from. And so something that says, in the seasons of your life when you need to rest, you are still loved and valued and valuable. I find that such a helpful and a healthy message in our society today. So thank you for pulling that out. Adam, did you have any thoughts about rest and Sabbath and all that sort of thing?
Only that I'm more around the kind of ideas of what the value of people and being valuable in times where you're not, yeah, being, actively kind of working things. When I went to a lecture by a Christian guy who's involved in kind of the space around AI and talking about the risks that we have in front of us with AI and people perhaps losing their jobs and maybe needing to look at what we mean by work again. And at the moment, work, particularly the work that we do as humans, is a lot about productivity and making things and making value and wealth for shareholders and things. But actually, perhaps if AI is all it's cracked up to be and takes, a lot of that kind of work, maybe there's more space for us to do other work and more kind of community building work, or perhaps there's more space for us to rest and there's more space for us to spend time within our religious communities and things and being with God. And that might actually, an optimistic take on this whole thing is that it might be able to bring about a world where we can be more human because we're not worried about that kind of constant striving for productivity and worth and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, and then that has really interesting, presumably connections to questions around, well, how do you then resource that? Do you need some kind
Yeah.
of universal basic income? If people's jobs are being done by AI and we're wanting to free them up for other types of work and rest, how do we make sure everyone's needs are met? I think you're right. It's a huge part of our pastoral context at the moment. I know I've spoken to people in the past week who work in coding and who work in acting, and both of them are being pushed out of work at the moment by AI. And so responding pastorally to that through our preaching is definitely important at the moment. Thank you for that. Anthony, you mentioned the leadership aspects of this passage earlier. I wondered if you wanted to say anything more about that.
I can do it. It's purely in really thinking about the Keir Starmer and that situation of kind of being damned if you do and damned if you don't. Whatever. There is a sense in which we are in a time where leadership is really toxic and it's a really difficult place to be. And whatever you do is going to be seen as wrong by somebody. And so again, that thing of just being very clear about your position and where you stand, and Jesus kind of reflecting that in what he says at the beginning of the passage about John being accused of having a demon and Jesus himself being accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. But then as he goes on to say, wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. It's our actions, it's the results that matter. A bit like a good tree bearing good fruit speak much louder than words. People want to see results. I think that's the situation we're in.
Mm, thank you. Um, shall we move on to one of the other passages? Was there another passage that you'd be keen to tie up to the passage from Matthew?
Yes, I think it was the Genesis story, which for me really resonated as well. I think I love the story of wells as places of refreshment, and but also of encounter. That for me is a really important. It was a really important theme that came through. I mean, Wells kind of run as a theme throughout Scripture, so it's a really nice one to be able to pick up. So I think I'd want to do that.
Mm. Yes, as you say, such an important place of encounter as well as refreshment and hospitality. And that's brilliant. Adam, what did you think of the Genesis passage?
Yeah, I think like a lot of Old Testament passages, there's some challenges of things
Mhm.
of if I read it as if I try to read it as not me, a relatively privileged white guy, there's some challenges in there about this kind of oddly arranged marriage, but also the kind of the like what I was talking about earlier, the kind of the stepping out into faith that and it talks several times about the kind of servant that their faith as well to pray their prayer and to kind of go and on this journey and do this long and perhaps in this sort of time dangerous traveling in that period wasn't not dangerous and then when the kind of fruits of that come out, it says that he kind of immediately like drops to his knees and praises the Lord and things. And so I thought that was a kind of nice reminder as well. But I'd be really interested to hear what you thought, Naomi, about how you read this passage as a woman as well.
I find it a really interesting passage. I have to say, there's a previous minister in my circuit. He used to tell the most amazing stories. And I remember him telling a version of this story that was almost like a midrash. It was sort of a retelling, a reimagining around the story. And in his version, Rebecca actually falls in love with the servant and thinks that she's going to marry the servant because she's out of the room when he has the whole conversation around, I've been sent by my master to find a wife for his son. And she gets called in and they say, do you want to go with this man? And she says, oh, yes, I'll go with this man who's given me this lovely jewelry and is so eloquent and, talks to me directly. And then when they've gone quite a way, she sees Isaac in the distance, works out what's going on, and at that point she puts on the veil. So he tells this version where she's actually in love with the servant, which now I can't unsee when I read this passage. But reading it from a perspective as a woman and very interested in feminist theology, I'm very interested in the fact that within this clearly very patriarchal structure, it's interesting that Rebecca has some agency. They do say to her, do you want to go with this man? And she makes a choice. She says, yes, I will. And there's also a whole section of feminist theology around women who are tricksters in the Old Testament, particularly women who exist within this very patriarchal structure and then find a way within that to exercise agency, usually through some kind of trickery. So, Rebecca, of course, later on in Genesis, is the brains behind, for good or for ill, Jacob effectively stealing Esau's birthright, and she changes the course of history in that way. And there's also when we come on to the psalm a bit later, and there's the whole thing about being brought before the king and presented as an object. I was struck by the fact that that's very much Esther's experience. But then again, within that patriarchal structure, she uses her position and a little bit of trickery to save the Jewish people from genocide. So there's something about women in the Old Testament who have no choice but to exist within the patriarchy, but find a way of subverting that and changing history. And there's something about people who exist within oppressive structures today, but who still find a clever way to exercise agency within that. So that struck me. Sorry, I talked for longer than I meant to. That happens whenever I start talking about feminist theology.
Well, I think my study Bible, and I always give credit to the study Bible where credit's due, tells you to scan forward as well a few verses to read a bit more about what is it Laban is actually like,
Mm,
and further in the story we see that perhaps he isn't that nice, and it isn't particularly that nice to women, and so perhaps there's also this I read it initially and thought all this being asked to leave your family and do all these kinds of
mm,
things and go really far away to marry someone you don't know but also there is perhaps a bit of, like you say, that agency of actually maybe I'd rather be not in this place because there might be something better out there for me.
mm,
I think that's a kind of powerful message as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Uh,
Anthony, did you have any thoughts about the challenges in this passage?
Yes, it was really interesting hearing what you were saying, Naomi, about Rebecca finding agency within a structure which is kind of tipped against her, because I think that's one of the things that that really struck me. You know, within that story, how there are those moments where she is able to ask questions, where she is able to make decisions, where she is the one who gives water, and that particularly, I was saying before about the theme of wells running through the Bible, and it just reminded me so much of the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. And you were saying before that you know Chester Cathedral really well, and you'll remember right in the heart of the cathedral, in the middle of the cloisters, in the cloister garden, there is a well with a sculpture by Stephen Broadbent of the Samaritan woman at the well, and it's a really interesting one because the way it's designed is to have the Samaritan woman at the top, giving the bowl to Jesus, who is underneath her. So there's a really interesting kind of reversal of the order of society, as this woman is the one who is has the agency and is giving him the water.
Mm. I love that sculpture. And
Mm,
there's a real sort of mutuality in the way that they're joined together, isn't there?
there is. So I think the only other thing I was going to say about that passage really was in terms of those spaces of encounter,
Mm.
and how I think this has always been something that I felt really strongly about, and particularly I think at the moment is we need these brave spaces of encounter, places where people can meet each other, particularly across differences in our society. So I think in places where perhaps voices, and in this case, thinking about the voices that perhaps go unheard, where they can be heard. Building on what you said there, Naomi, about those patriarchal links between the psalm and the reading from Genesis, I'd love to talk a bit more about the psalm, actually. And even though I do so as somebody with multiple layers of privilege, and so, as someone who's benefited from those patriarchal structures and continues to do so, I can still stand next to a female colleague, and people will ignore them and talk to me, or they will assume that I am the more senior one, when I'm not. It's context in a very patriarchal culture. I mean, just in those few verses, we've got references to king, lord, sons, fathers, princes. It's very, very male. He is your Lord, bow to him. There is an assumption behind this psalm, which is a kind of wedding psalm, that the bride in this case has got to forget her people and her father's house, lay everything aside, and become part of the property of the king who she's going to marry. And obviously that comes in our context, there are all kinds of difficulties and things that we would want to question, rightly, in that, I think. And it's a real contrast, I think, though, if we put this together with the Genesis passage, with the agency that Rebecca has. And of course, if we think about kings and their brides, the one that comes to my mind from the Old Testament is the story of Esther as well, who of course is able to use her position in order to save her people, and I think that's it's a real challenge within that context to think about how that might be possible for someone to push back and to challenge that system and find ways through it.
Great. So if we move on to the Romans passage, Anthony, did you have any thoughts about that passage?
Like the others have already said, I think for me, what Paul is describing really does resonate with my own experience as he describes this wrestling, this internal wrestling with knowing what he should do but not being able to do it, or doing what he knows deep down he shouldn't do. But I think there's a bigger challenge here, really, because I think this can become a very individualistic reading of the passage, where we just worry about our little peccadillos, our little sins, if you like, of forgetting to put the top on the toothpaste or whatever it might be, and we miss the much bigger story that's going on here. Tom Wright talks about these chapters being
a parallel with the story of the Exodus. So chapter 6, Romans 6, parallels the crossing of the Red Sea, and then we get into chapter 7 and the people arrive at Mount Sinai where they're given the law, and then chapter 8 they arrive in the promised land, and then we have the whole renewal of creation. And I think it's really important to place this wrestling of Paul's in that much bigger context, so that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is, in a sense, he is representative of all of us in that wrestling that goes on, and those the power of the sin that he's talking about. This sin is pervasive. It is within our systems and structures. It's not only within our hearts as well. It's both and, not either or. And I think if we think a little bit about that kind of movement towards chapter 8 actually, and the renewal of creation, and the fact that July is plastic free July, and how the very hot weather we've been having has perhaps made us think about a little bit more about how we might respond better to the climate crisis. I do wonder about how we can struggle sometimes with making the right decisions around our response to those huge questions of those huge issues of the climate emergency, and it can be really difficult to know what the right thing is to do. So we might try and give up plastics, and we know that that's a good thing and that we should try and do it. But then there are knock-on effects, aren't there? Like the fact that it can be more expensive. Products can have a shorter shelf life and lead to more waste. So we can end up wrestling with what really is the right thing to do. Boycotting things, for example, can lead to the people producing those products actually suffering, and so we know what we want to do, but we want to make a difference, but then we have these kind of other reasons why the things we want to do might not be the best, and that there may be unintended consequences. And obviously we do need to work through that. That's the wrestling that Paul is going through. But we shouldn't be paralyzed by it. And I think to some extent what Paul describes is a kind of paralysis that comes about when we are wrestling with ourselves and being weighed down by that burden of guilt and anxiety. And of course, for Paul, the impasse is broken when he gets to the end of the passage we're looking at, where he says, "Wretched man that I am," that's the kind of the climax, "who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord." That for him, in Jesus, we find the kind of the breakthrough that we need, so that we aren't stuck not being able to do anything, but we do see that there is hope, and that there are things that we can do positively towards a better world in this case, or towards justice.
Adam, did you have any thoughts about the Romans passage?
I don't think I had any particularly deep thoughts other than what a good passage this is. Like it's really like there's some really strong stuff about like instead I do what I hate, and you do this thing stuff of your sinful nature. You want to do what's good, but you don't. That you inevitably do what is wrong. There's a war in his mind and all these kinds of things that I think are really powerful. I think like this is there's parts of the Bible that are quite tough to read or tough to get through, and I think this is really kind of visualized and really powerfully written. But that it then turns around, and I'm thankful they included that last verse in the reading that says, "Thank God, the answer is in Jesus Christ our Lord." And so yeah, I just reflected that I really enjoyed reading this and enjoyed having that last verse in there because it does feel, it feels very relatable, I'm sure, to everybody. All of these things that you can try and do as much good as you can, but everybody's always going to slip and fall. Yeah.
I wrote the exact same word. I wrote relatable, because
Yeah.
obviously passages of Paul's writing, perhaps especially Romans, can be quite dense. And as you say, not so easy to get something relatable from. But this, I think everyone would read this and think, yes, I can visualize the things in my life that I try not to do and I still do, or vice versa. I know quite often I'll think, right, I'm not going to waste time doom scrolling on my phone anymore. And then my hand will just, of its own volition, reach for my phone and go to a social media app and start scrolling. And it's so easy to do the things that we very intentionally decide not to do. As you say, I'm glad that it comes on to a more hopeful note. It reminded me of a conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago about how justification is something that happens all at once. God has paid the price, so we are forgiven, and that is complete and true and amazing. But then that process of sanctification is something that happens every day. Every day we need to make those difficult choices to try and turn towards God and away from evil and to persist in that. And there will be days where we do the things that we know we shouldn't do. But then the next day is a new day and we try again. And there's a message of hope and persistence in there that I think is so important for people who are doing this work of campaigning and advocacy and being alongside. Like Anthony was saying earlier, that can be so exhausting if you've been campaigning for racial justice for 40 years and very little seems to have changed. It's hard to persist and keep doing the things you know you should do. So, as you say, I'm glad that there's the message of hope in there as well.
I find it interesting that it is all quite and maybe this is challenging for how I look at things. It's all quite this stuff that comes from within myself, is this stuff that is tempting, is it's the sin, I think there's alternative translations that talks about it coming from his flesh and that, like
Mm,
things like that. It's very internal. Some of the stuff that JP talks about that might link to this as we talk about the gambling industry and the harms caused by problematic gambling. And I wonder how you think this plays with also external forces kind of making us, like you say, reaching for that social media app. Well, there's a part of that that is obviously our faults and our own kind of predispositions to want to do that and want to distract ourselves. But there's also a level of being within a world that is trying to attract us to a lot of these things. And so that's what when we talk about gambling, one of the things that we will always ask about or ask for is greater restrictions on the advertising of gambling, particularly when it's targeted at people with kind of problematic gambling habits. And so I wonder if there's something that might be another way of looking at things that maybe isn't as clear in this passage, is that there is stuff from the outside world kind of pulling us to that way as well, and maybe just tugs on what these social media companies or these gambling companies have identified, perhaps quite rightly, that are these that there is the desires of flesh, that kind of
mm,
stuff is this the things that we are maybe somewhat predisposed to, or that yeah, pull the right strings in within us to make us fall from those places.
yes, yes. So it's more about our vulnerabilities rather
Mm.
than something about human beings or flesh in particular being inherently bad. I think that's
Mm.
something that when I have the opportunity to have long conversations with Paul, one of the many things that I might push him on a little bit is that I think human bodies are something to be celebrated. They're part of God's creation, not something that we should feel ashamed of. So yes, I think you're really wise to point out the external forces that perhaps try and play on our vulnerabilities and draw us away from God. And so we're needing to do that constant work of turning towards God and away from those things that are not life-giving. That was really helpful. Thank you. And Anthony, is there anything else that you would like to share?
I think the only other thread I'd want to perhaps tug on a little bit that we haven't talked about is the role of children, particularly in the gospel reading, where Jesus says, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise and intelligent and have revealed them to infants, to little children." And of course, this is a repeated theme in for Jesus, especially in Matthew's gospel. We come across it again in Matthew 18 and 19. Jesus kind of bringing a child in front of the disciples and saying, you need to be like this child, and then blessing the children and saying, "Let them come to me." So there is something really important about the child in Jesus's thinking, and in terms of what's revealed to them, and in terms of them as an example, really, for good discipleship, and I think some of that is around, again, this idea of agency, and the fact that little children especially would have had the least agency, really, in the society of that time. They had no choices of their own to make. Everything was decided for them, and so to be in that position, to be that vulnerable, and yet Jesus is saying, these are the people that he has come for. These are the people that God has revealed himself to, and so I think that can really tell us a lot about how in society we need to think about those who have the least agency, those who are not able to make decisions for themselves because of the systems and the structures that we have in place, and to try and support them. So in the case of I'm reading from Genesis and the Psalm, obviously that's focuses much more on women and their lack of agency, and then here in the gospel reading we have this reference to little children, and so I think that might be another theme that I might want to draw out if I was going to be preaching on these passages.
Great. So thank you so much, Adam and Anthony, for being with us today and for everything that you've shared. You might have spotted we've had a few technical difficulties today, but hopefully all of you listening have found this a helpful resource for your preaching and worship leading this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and share this episode with your friends. And we've got some online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms, because social media is not inherently bad. So thank you so much for being with us today, for everything that you've shared, and those of you who've been listening. And we wish you a wonderful week and every blessing in your preaching, your leading of worship, and your discipleship this week. Thank you.